everyone, and welcome to the Surgical Ergonomics podcast, where we will be discussing everything related to surgical and procedural ergonomics, the people, ideas, and technology that will help enhance your physical wellness and career longevity. I am your host, Geeta Lal. I'm an academic endocrine surgeon, speaker, consultant, and surgical ergonomics coach. Having experienced work-related musculoskeletal injury myself, I am committed to increasing awareness of and developing solutions to counteract the impact of poor ergonomics on the professional and personal lives of healthcare workers in procedural areas. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Pearson Ravitz. For many of you, your career is your calling, so don't let an unforeseen injury or accident take that away. Pearson Ravitz, a firm founded by a physician, specializes in disability and life insurance tailored for healthcare providers like you. They understand the risks you face and offer real education and guidance. It's about more than a policy. It's about peace of mind. Head to surgicalergonomics.com/podcast/ and click on the Pearson Ravitz logo to take the first step in protecting your future. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Surgical Ergonomics podcast. In today's episode, I am delighted to welcome Gil Spitz. Gil is originally a classical musician, and he shifted his focus to ergonomics and preventative exercise to help musicians with repetitive motion injuries. He then furthered this expertise with an MS in exercise physiology, researching optimized training for first responders. A few years ago, in 2019, he joined the Medical ICU team at Baylor St. Luke's Medical Center, developing and enacting exercise plans for medically compromised patients. Since 2021, he has been with the Liver Transplant team implementing a hospital-wide method for assessing transplant patients' physical suitability, providing post-transplant follow-up, and developing a virtual pre-habilitation program to improve patient outcomes. During this time, he has also worked with the surgical staff, helping them prevent musculoskeletal and repetitive motion injuries. Gil has worked with providers on a one-to-one basis, addressing specific needs and issues, as well as presenting on the topic of OR ergonomics, inter and intra-op preventive exercises to incoming resident cohorts during an annual bootcamp at Baylor College of Medicine. So without further ado, hello, Gil, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Super happy to be here.
Wonderful. So, Gil, our listeners have just heard a little bit about your background in the intro. I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit more about this time as a musician and what inspired you then to kind of shift gears into exercise physiology.
So, one of the things about musicians is they're exceptionally body aware. I studied percussion and classical guitar, and my percussion teacher was one of the foremost experts, Eugene Novotny, by the way, shout out to him, foremost experts on something known as the molar technique, which is a very specific way of using your body and really maximizing efficiency. So you're using gravity as much as possible. You're trying to let gravity do as much of the work for you, and you can develop a very specific pattern for whip strokes. Similarly, most of the instructors that I had also were instructors in body movement and body pattern, things like Feldenkrais, the Alexander technique. One of the things that you see in music, this is especially true in guitar, is it's not about how fast you can move your muscles. It's really about how quickly you can relax them once you use them. So there was an awful lot of body awareness just kind of built into my study of music. And one of the things that you see even in people that are exceptionally aware of their bodies, when you spend hours and hours practicing, and then you go into, even if you enjoy the crowd and the aspect of performing, what is a relatively high stress environment, and then perform for, anywhere from 45 minutes to several hours, there are going to be problems. There's going to be imbalances that make themselves known. And if you aren't actively addressing those imbalances, you will end up with some distinct problems. And, just about every single musician that I worked with at one point or another had to take a break, had to rethink their movement patterns, which is really difficult when you spend 8, 10, 12 hours a day practicing movement patterns. They would have to do some type of PT, OT, and it became really, really apparent that there was a need out there. At a certain point, I found one that I needed to address issues in my own body. Definitely, when you play classical guitar, usually you have your foot up on a footstool, your arms are, everything is kind of set to one side. I developed a whole bunch of tendonitis in my left side, shoulder, elbow, thumb, all of this stuff, some hip issues, all sorts of things like that. And kind of in my research to what I needed to do to fix my problems, I became aware that I really loved the pool of knowledge that I was diving into, anatomy, physiology, exercise physiology in particular, how the body responds to these movement patterns, the energetic sources that we use for different types of movements, different types of efforts. So it became really clear to me that there was a pull here, and that combined with a distinct need, I kind of said, I speak music. I can definitely learn how to speak exercise physiology, therapy, that sort of thing. If I can translate one to the other, I can help people. I can maybe even make a decent living doing that. But really, at the end of the day, it's as we've talked about in the past, you kind of find a passion. And, it became really clear to me that this was something that was going to keep me fulfilled.
Wow. As I'm sitting here listening to this portion of your journey, I'm reminded of a couple of things that I think we might have in common in our journeys. One is that your need was driven by your need to understand a little bit more about sort of your body mechanics as a classical guitarist were kind of what drove you to learn more, right? And so that
100%.
was similar for me. It was my pain that then incited me to look into this topic, for
Well,
surgeons a little bit more. And then I think the other connection I just made is that when you talked about sort of various techniques, including the Alexander technique, I remember when I first went to see my primary care physician about the jaw pain and neck pain that I was having, she pointed out, you're standing in these awkward postures and, have you looked into musicians and Alexander technique? And she referred me to someone at my institution who was familiar with the Alexander technique. She gave me some YouTube videos,
mhm.
well vetted ones to look at. And so that's when I also became aware, again, probably patients don't realize that surgeons have, these musculoskeletal issues. And I didn't realize that the musicians that I was seeing on concerts and things like that were having, similar issues. But when you think about it, it makes sense. It's awkward postures, repetitive tasks, all these things. So lots of commonality. So I was just struck by that when you were, describing this.
And to kind of add on to what you're saying, I think for a lot of people, the tension that they hold, it's almost like the noise of an air conditioner. You don't even notice it till it turns off. And
Right.
I've taught a lot of classes, and one of the things that we teach are progressive relaxation techniques. And one of the first things I tell people is, clench your jaws really tight and now empty them. A lot of people don't even realize that they were holding their jaws tight until they actually tense them and then release them. And it's the same for tension all over the body. A lot of people don't even realize what they're doing until it's kind of too late. And then the volume is so loud that it's impossible to ignore.
To ignore. Yeah, yeah. And that's kind of, I think we've talked about this before. It's the surgeon and OR personnel, nurses, scrub techs. We all have this, we're so focused on the task as hand, as I suspect musicians are as well. And I like to say, as an endocrine surgeon, cortisol and adrenaline, when they're circulating in the body, when you're focused at the task at hand, they're such good anti-inflammatories, right? So you don't feel it when you're doing your work, you feel it much later, right?
100%, 100%.
Right. So, this is again, I love hearing about people's journeys. So I appreciate you sharing, kind of this pivot. So let's talk more about this pivot. Now, you learned this for yourself. You're sharing this knowledge among your musician colleagues and peers, and then you encounter, somewhere, surgical personnel. So how did this shift occur? What gave you sort of, insights into what issues, surgeons and surgical personnel might be facing? What were your observations, and then how did they kind of, fuel this pivot, if it were?
Bear with me for a second. This will be a little bit of a circle. When I was doing my grad work, originally I had wanted to connect music and exercise.
Hmm.
And I was kind of doing research on what was already out there. And one of the coolest things I encountered was somebody had taken a drummer and hooked them up to a VO2 max testing machine, a mask that measures the oxygen and carbon dioxide coming in and out of the body, all of that. And they found that playing drums was the equivalent of moderate to vigorous physical activity. It was a form of exercise. And I came up with this concept of the musician as an athlete. I always kind of had thought about it, but it was one of these things that I was starting to refine. It was, what is an athlete? An athlete is somebody that uses their kinesthetic knowledge, their understanding of how they move their body, where their body is in space, to create very precise, repeatable motions with very precise, repeatable results. In music, it's taking the instrument and making a very specific set of notes in a very specific set of times with really careful attention to the tone that you're creating. When I came to the medical world and I started actually thinking about surgeons, surgery, medical tasks, when I observed my first surgery in person, right away I made that connection. I was like, oh my goodness, they don't know it. Maybe they do, but they are athletes. They are doing exactly what I've always thought an athlete does. They are performing these very precise motions. They're creating very precise results. They're spending hours and hours using their body and understanding where their body is in space so that they can manipulate these tools, the robots, the machines, whatever. And in this case, in an extremely high pressure environment. I'll tell you, I mean, I've played some very serious concerts. I felt the pressure. I don't even want to know what it's like to know that you are in a person's body affecting their life moving forward. The most important thing I did was hopefully make somebody's evening really, really great. They heard some good music. As a medical professional, the stakes are so much higher, the stress is so much higher, and the tension, I mean, it's palpable. I'm always amazed by how easily, how well many of the surgeons I know just kind of wipe off the day, or at least seem to, and then go about their business. And that's one of the things we'll probably talk about in a little bit that always surprises me, that I think needs to have more attention paid to it. The post-op period, I think, is critical and is kind of getting ignored. I don't think there's anywhere near enough attention being paid to recovery, and I don't think it's being taken nearly as seriously as it should, especially when you start thinking about these people as athletes.
Right. Well, thank you for sharing that. And, I think I'll just probably follow up what we talked about with just this last sentence that you mentioned. So in a lot of the surgical literature, when they talk about ergonomics, it's actually, you'll see a lot of titles saying, surgeons as elite athletes, we must take care of our bodies like elite athletes, right? So, you've also brought that up and you've shared some of your observations. I wonder if you could share what your perspectives are on what sort of, let's say, a professional athlete's recovery period is like, who's on their recovery team.
Yeah.
And as you said, at least the surgeons you've seen, not much attention is paid to this recovery period. So who should be on, surgical team members' recovery team? How can they utilize that time in between cases or between the next, one day's cases and next day's cases
Yeah.
to ensure that they're functioning optimally?
Yeah, and this is one of the things where we start running into a couple of problems just because of the nature of medicine and surgical interventions. But if you look at elite athletes nowadays, the area where they probably spend the most amount of their own personal money is on recovery. Almost every elite athlete out there has some type of sleep consultant, somebody that helps them, we call it sanitize their sleep environment. So create a time and space that is dedicated to the body's recovery. So incredibly important to get good sleep. I mean, the research on muscle response, protein synthesis, anabolic response to rest and recovery is super important. So I would definitely say at least some type of consultation with a sleep specialist. If you have some type of apnea, sleep apnea, something like that, that absolutely has to be addressed. You need to have exceptional quality sleep. And again, I know that runs into some issues. A lot of surgeries happen at odd times of day. A lot of surgeries are emergent. You can't predict that kind of stuff. But when you can, pay special attention to it. Another thing that we see has become very, very useful as a tool is some type of cryotherapy. Whether it's a dunk in an ice bath, or there's some of these high-end places where you go and they put you in the little pod with liquid nitrogen, some type of way of addressing inflammation. Because when you use your muscles for extended periods of time, inflammation is part and parcel of the course. In fact, the muscle remodeling process is essentially an inflammatory process. And this gets into a whole other discussion about hormones, hormone regulation, that sort of thing. I would also suggest this isn't necessarily the recovery part of it, but I think that absolutely everybody who's on a surgical team should at least have a consultation with an FMS specialist, a functional movement screen specialist. This was something that was developed by Ray Cook and I can't remember his first name, but Burton. And basically, it's working through a series of movement patterns so that you can identify weaknesses and imbalances, and then you can have corrective exercises to understand what exactly it is that your body needs. Well, one of the things I will say about that, and I'll probably get in a little bit of trouble for this, I think the FMS is a fantastic tool for identifying issues. I do think that a certain number, and this is probably true in every field, but a certain number of FMS specialists tend to be a bit dogmatic about what exercises are appropriate and how to correct the imbalances. But I think it's an excellent tool for identifying those imbalances. And I think it's really difficult to talk about recovery without knowing where your imbalances lie and without understanding, oh, I have a lot more tension on my right leg because of how I stand. One of the things that I found when I was playing percussion, I actually played in a steel band, steel pan, for a long time, and I was putting almost all of my weight on my right leg and keeping time with my left leg. And that
Mm-hmm.
led to all sorts of issues with my hips. And I would have never even thought about that, except that, I did perform one of these screens. And right away, the guy was like, what's going on with your right side? Why is that so different? And we kind of talked it through and were able to figure that out. So I definitely think that that is one of the key things that anybody who's serious about their physical health should definitely address.
This was all great information, Gil, and let me see if I can unpack some of this now for our listeners. So we all know, as you mentioned, sleep is key to the recovery process, and medical training, surgical training, and medical surgical work for scrub techs, nurses, surgeons is by nature sometimes unpredictable given the type of surgery you do, but still it would be helpful to have a sleep assessment, like you said, to see and optimize whatever you can, optimize your rest process. If you're sleeping during the daytime, maybe you need to have really blackout shades and, all these things to help address that. So that's important. And thank you for bringing that up. The second thing you mentioned was this functional movement screen. And, I think many listeners like me are going to be, well, I don't know, I've not come across that specialist in my work, but I do know what, a physical therapist or an occupational therapist is. Can I get a physical therapist to do an assessment to see how I'm imbalanced? Because that's something of what they do, and then they prescribe exercises. So is that reasonable if they can't find a functional movement screen certified person?
Yeah, absolutely. For most surgeons, I would say, especially because there's so much usage of the hands, arms, shoulders, everything kind of from here on down, I think OT would absolutely be appropriate. Physical therapists also really good at looking at imbalances, especially in the post-injury phase. One of the things that I think, and we kind of talked about the volume, not noticing the injury. I think one of the things that people need to think about is this kind of preemptive approach to it. So, even if you're not feeling that you have an impingement, you should just go see somebody who actually looks at the way bodies move. And, they might tell you, hey, raise your arms, and they'll notice that, oh my goodness, when you get to about shoulder height, you're starting to listen to your shoulder instead of actually raising your arm like you should be able to do. I
Yeah.
would say one other person that would be very important would be some type of mobility expert and or an expert in stretching. There's a couple different forms of stretching. One of the most useful for recovery is something known as PNF. And essentially, it's somebody else. So it's passive to active stretching, somebody else moving your limbs for you and creating sufficient tension to really improve the range of motion. One of the things that we see is with these injuries, our range of motion becomes very limited. And the ability to actually move a joint through its full range of motion becomes exceptionally important when we're thinking about recovery and when we're thinking about avoiding the injury in general. So I would also look for some type of stretch specialist.
Okay. And we'll be back right after the short break. Surgeons and proceduralist colleagues, we trained for years to master what we do, but most of us are never taught how to protect our bodies while doing our jobs. Neck pain, shoulder fatigue, back stiffness after long cases. For many of us, this isn't the exception, it's routine. That's why, starting on February 16th, 2026, I'm launching the first cohort of a virtual hybrid coaching program in surgical and procedural ergonomics, designed for clinicians who want to perform at a high level without sacrificing physical health or career longevity. The program includes 2 small group sessions plus 2 individualized one-on-one coaching sessions using PostChecker, which is an AI-based motion capture system that provides personalized, actionable ergonomic insights both inside and outside the OR. I'm Geeta Lal, an endocrine surgeon with over 2 decades in the operating room and firsthand experience with the pain that comes from operating. I'm joined in this endeavor by Linda Miller, an occupational therapist and certified professional ergonomist, and together we bring real-world OR-tested solutions to you. If you're ready to invest in your performance and your longevity, email me at geeta@surgicalergonomics.com to get details and register. Your body is not disposable. Your career shouldn't be either. Well, thank you, Gil, for that. And for our listeners, maybe you're just joining us for the first time for this episode with Gil, but if you listen to any of the other episodes and even happen to look on the Society of Surgical Ergonomics website or the American College of Surgeons Ergonomics recommendations, you'll see that they all advise what Gil and I have just been talking about, right? You need a strengthening and stretching program. That is key to the recovery process. Even if you don't currently have your check engine light on, meaning there isn't an injury, a painful site that's bothering you, if you do
Absolutely.
this on a regular basis, think of it as preventative maintenance on your car, right? I mean, you
Exactly
get
right.
you get more mileage out of it if you take regular care of it, right?
That's
So
exactly right. Got to change the oil.
right, right. So this is, think about this. And I always, people always say, well, I don't have time. I don't have after a long day, how do I go and find such and such specialist? And I say, you know what? If you don't have time to do all these things, it's okay. Go to who you can. That's why I asked, hospitals, we have access to physical therapists, we have access to occupational therapists, and sometimes I say, even, if you know someone who has a personal trainer, get them to kind of do an assessment, especially to check the weaknesses and imbalances, and then prescribe you some sort of focused stretching and strengthening program for your unique kind of, body mechanics, if it
You
were.
know, you put it in a much nicer way than I do. When I talk to people about this and they tell me something like, I don't have time,
Yeah,
I always think about this as a return on investment. And when I encounter that, I usually say, hey, don't worry about it. You'll have plenty of time when you burn out in about 3 years and can't operate anymore.
yeah,
So, it's really the options are prioritize your physical capacity now or risk really cutting your career short. And that's one of the things, again, kind of coming back to the elite athlete perspective. The reason these athletes spend so much time and money and why these teams spend so much time and money on the body, on keeping people healthy and fit and ready for action is because the investment they've already made. And
right.
I mean, I won't pretend to know what medical school costs and having to go through residency and fellowship and all this stuff, but that's a massive investment. You've invested money and time and your sweat and protect that investment. If you want to be able to operate well into doesn't even matter what age. If you want to quit on your terms, if you want to say, hey, I've cut my last cut, I've sewn my last stitch, I'm good, that's great. But it really shouldn't be, I can't do this anymore because it hurts.
Yeah.
So if you want to protect your investment, spend the time, spend the money now, prioritize your health. Otherwise, there's a really good chance that you won't be able to later on.
Right. No, well said. And this is what we keep trying to instill through the society and this podcast that, a preventative maintenance program goes a long way to protect your investment. But, what you just said brings up another sort of culture shift that we need to adopt in the medical profession, right? So people are beginning to see the importance of this, but then they wonder, well, my institution won't support me going and getting this, or they're gonna why should I have to pay for it? And I just realized that when you started this description about elite athletes, you actually said they spend their personal money on this because it's neither here nor there for the current team that they're employed on. If they're injured, they'll find another player. Just like if you're injured, they'll find another surgeon to take your place.
Yeah,
But it's going to affect your life, your retirement, your enjoyment, of your post-career life. So,
yeah,
whatever you think about sort of the institution, the culture, I think the organizations eventually will catch on. But until then, if you have to spend a little bit of your own money to take care of these things, do consider it. I realize it's very hard as a trainee, but as attendings, there shouldn't be, that excuse of the financial straint. We spend money on so many different things. This is one really important thing with a high return on investment, as you said.
absolutely.
All right. Now I'm going to follow up on something else you mentioned because, I wasn't familiar with it until I was on a panel at a society meeting, and the panel actually included an exercise physiologist. And they mentioned that I think they spent a lot of time training with athletes as well, college athletes, etc. And they said, there's a good amount of literature that shows that, performance is affected by, whether you're male or female, and for women at different times in their hormonal life cycle,
Oh yeah.
so and that came as news to me, right? Even as a physician, as a female physician, I've spent my entire life trying to sort of meld in and not be thought of as differently from the boys, right? We had a lot to prove at a time where there weren't that many women in surgery. And so it's interesting to me from another perspective because when he mentioned this, then I was at a women's surgery meeting and I was surprised how many of us between the ages of 45 and 55 had experienced frozen shoulders, okay?
Mhm.
And then to figure out that this is now, data showing that this is kind of part of that hormonal transition
Oh, 100%.
was news to me. So I was wondering, as an exercise physiologist and an expert, as you said, in sort of how the body moves, I'd like to hear your perspectives on this. And then how does it change how you counsel, the surgical team members that you're working with? Do you prescribe different things for, male versus female clients, etc.?
So there's a couple things to kind of unpack there. One, absolutely. So women and men, very different body types. Women tend to have a much higher percentage of slow twitch muscle fibers. They can gain relative strength in the same proportions to men, but absolute strength tends to be a bit lower. They also tend to have more range of motion, which oftentimes can lead to more injuries, especially when we're talking about repetitive tasks. Men can usually train a bit heavier. Women tend to be much better at these prolonged tasks. I mean, one of the things that this actually I've kind of come to appreciate is that when you're looking at these long surgery times, there's actually a much better potential for women to do well with them when properly trained. One of the things that we absolutely see, I definitely worked with a lot of athletes at the college level. One of the things that we saw with teams, especially of female athletes, was, once they would cycle together, we could take advantage of that because we could understand where they were in their menstrual cycle and kind of cater the training to that. As their hormone levels went up, we spiked the intensity. As they came down, we kind of focused more on mobility and recovery. Once you get into perimenopause and postmenopausal time periods for women, their estrogen levels plummet. It kind of it happens to everyone. All of our hormones are changing. But one of the things that you see with estrogen is it's an anti-inflammatory. And as soon as women kind of hit that age, they start seeing a lot more of these itises, tendinitis, whatever. All of these things become a lot more pronounced, which kind of leads to, like you said, different ways of training. One of the things that I try to focus on is we have a very, and it changes over time, but we have a very clear understanding of the exercise dose response for hormones. With men, if they want to maintain their testosterone levels, lift heavy. You got to move some weight. For women, one of the things that we've seen, and this is still kind of an emerging field, is that higher volumes produce more of a hormonal response. So one of the things that we see is if we can simulate higher loads at a lower load, but with a higher volume, we can kind of get that hormonal response. And one of the tools that I've sort of started using and I've seen good response to is blood flow restriction. This is something that has been used by meatheads in the gym for ages and ages. In the last couple of years, there's been more of an emphasis on that in physical therapy, especially ACL injuries. If you've just had an ACL repair, you can't load up that knee. But if we restrict the blood flow to the leg, just doing simple leg extensions will produce that response so that you can, at the very least, maintain, if not actually build muscle. And I'm going to get a little geeky here, but from an exercise standpoint, what we're really looking at is blood occlusion of around 80%, using about 30% of your one rep max. So if you can, just for ease, bench press 100 pounds, what we're looking to do is wrap cuffs around your upper arms and have you bench press 30 pounds, something that shouldn't really challenge you physically, but because of that restriction of the blood flow, you will definitely feel the burn, you will feel the swell, all of that. And, one of the things that I think is important, different types of musculature are appropriate for different tasks. I don't believe that I have ever seen a surgery where being bulky is a bonus, is a plus. So we're not looking.
I'd second that.
Yeah, so we're not
So,
looking to develop bodybuilders. We're
mhm.
looking to develop something more akin to a marathon runner, or even a gymnast, somebody that has a lot of strength, somebody that can withstand the rigors, but at the same time, they're not bound by the fact that their muscles are so big they can't move around. So that's one of the things that has been really exciting for me in the recent past, is kind of following this. It's not really a new technology or technique, but a new application for this.
I see. Well, this is all very fascinating to me as well, but I will tell our listeners, Gil is talking about the research in this area. We're not suggesting you put tight bands on your arms or legs
100%.
and go work out, okay? And certainly not
100%.
without any sort of supervision and evaluation. All right, so
Oh,
don't do
100%.
that.
I mean, there's definitely issues, higher rate of blood clots. If you have any type of kidney issues,
Right,
these aren't
right.
things that you should be doing. Again, just to follow up on what you're saying, these are things that are kind of exciting developments looking into the
Exactly.
future.
Yeah. Now, while we're on this topic, I'm going to ask one more question related to kind of hormonal changes because, a lot of pregnant surgeons, right? They're going to try to keep working as long as they can, and it brings a whole unique set of ergonomics challenges because they're
Mhm.
further away from the OR table, all of these things. But we've actually talked on a previous episode of the podcast, one of the earlier ones with Pam Hess, actually, about how because of circulating levels of hormones and then later in pregnancy, relaxin, etc., pregnant women are going to be more prone to injury. So, what are your tips for pregnant surgeons or surgical techs, nurses in the OR? What are their, what extra precautions or particular things should they be thinking about?
Yeah, one of the things that we see is, again, a lot of these shoulder injuries, and we spend an incredible amount of time nowadays, just because of modern culture, kind of in this protracted state.
Yeah, forward
And
head posture. Yeah.
that's exactly it. And I would say that focusing on scapular retraction is the first thing I would recommend for anybody who's doing that kind of work. But again, especially somebody who's concerned about stuff like that, 100%. It's going to help, especially again, when you have that much weight in front of you. There's just so much changing about your body mechanics. So focusing on postural techniques, one of the best things you can do. So definitely anything that works shoulder retraction, any type of chin tuck, anything where you're focusing on your head position. This isn't new information, but as soon as you start leaning forward, just the laws of torque, your head goes from feeling like it weighs the 12 pounds that it weighs to feeling like it weighs 40, 50, 60 pounds as soon as you start looking over.
Yeah, I share
So
that graphic in all my talks. So people who listen to me talk have seen that forward head, weight of the head on the spine graphic.
100%. And it's not too different when you're carrying that weight around your belly.
Sure,
Okay. So,
sure.
your body is being pulled into this, I don't want to say unnatural, but it's being pulled into a
Non-neutral.
state.
We can say non-neutral.
There we go. So a state that
Yeah.
it's not used to.
Right.
And it's going to try to compensate. So again, really working on postural techniques. This is where, kind of harkening back to the beginning of the discussion, I think talking to somebody who is an expert at Alexander and or Feldenkrais techniques would really be helpful. Just a way to find the least amount of effort to maintain a neutral body position.
Understood. Understood. Well, Gil, I always say this, every single time. It's like we start this conversation. I know I send questions ahead of time, but then we go on all these interesting ideas, and then I think I want to have more of this. And so I think what we're going to do is I'm going to have you come back
Oh, I would love that.
on the podcast for another episode. This will be kind of introduction from the perspective of an exercise physiologist. And I just want to, again, in this last minute or so, just take a moment to acknowledge that you're joining me at the end of your workday on a Friday, just before you go for a weekend. And that just speaks volumes to me about how much you care about helping, the surgeons that you're working with. Of course, you work with the patients, but you've taken this on at your institution and are coaching them and helping them prolong their careers. And I just want to acknowledge that and express my sincerest thanks for the work that you're doing and continue to do.
Well, if the surgeons don't work, I don't work. So
So
I'm protecting my investment.
got it.
But
Good,
I will
good
say
point.
it's been an absolute treat talking to you. I do look forward to talking to you again. And you're right. This definitely comes from a place. And again, harkening back to the beginning of our conversation, there's a need, and somebody's got to fulfill it. And I definitely this is a topic that speaks to me very deeply. I've felt this connection going back to the music days. It's really good to find an audience.
Mhm.
It's good to find people who see the same things that I'm seeing.
Agreed, agreed. There is certainly a growing movement, want for data and expertise in this area. And, it's ripe for students who are interested in this area in whichever field they're in, physical therapy, occupational therapy, surgeons who are interested in research, exercise physiologists. And, I'm really grateful that, as I said, that you're doing this as well. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media, Instagram, X, Facebook, and LinkedIn. We love feedback, so please reach out to us for topics, ideas, speakers, or if you ever want to be a guest on the show. Thank you for listening.